While he didn't disclose it, the sheriff says investigators do have a theory for a motive.
We believe we know why he did this, and we believe that it was targeted, but we're not 100% sure of that. And so it'd be silly to tell people, yeah, don't worry about it. You're not his target. No, you could be.
The blood was already dry by the time anyone thought to look. That detail would haunt investigators for months. The way it had settled into the grout lines of the kitchen floor, the way a small smear near the back door had gone dark and stiff, pressed flat against the threshold as though something had paused there before continuing into the dark. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no shattered glass. Just a house that looked, from the outside, like every other house on that quiet street in Tucson, Arizona, and inside, the unmistakable evidence that something had gone terribly wrong. Nancy Guthrie was gone. It was the kind of disappearance that makes seasoned law enforcement stop mid-sentence. Not because of the violence, though there was evidence of that, but because of the absence of logic. 84 years old. A woman whose world had narrowed, as it does for so many people in their later years, to the familiar rhythms of a home she knew inside and out. Her schedule was consistent. Her neighbors recognized her. Her family knew her routines. And yet, on the morning she was reported missing, the only things left behind were questions no one could immediately answer, and a blood trail that ended at the back door as though it had simply vanished into the Arizona air. No suspect, no forced entry, no witnesses, no explanation. For the first 24 hours, investigators worked under the assumption that there was a rational explanation waiting just around the corner. An elderly woman with limited mobility doesn't disappear under ordinary circumstances, which meant these circumstances were anything but ordinary. The absence of forced entry was the first detail that refused to settle quietly. Doors locked, windows intact, no sign of mechanical tampering on any point of entry. Whoever had been inside that house had either been invited, possessed a means of access that left no trace, or had arrived before Nancy Guthrie had any reason to lock her door at all. That last possibility, the one investigators were most reluctant to voice aloud, was the one that would eventually change the entire direction of the case. In the weeks that followed, the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie would draw national attention. Investigative reporter Brian Entin, known for his work on cases that fall through the cracks of local coverage, began tracking the story closely. What he found when he arrived in Tucson wasn't a case progressing toward resolution. It was a case standing completely still.
Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos telling us they're still working to identify that masked man at Nancy's home.
Do you think that this suspect could strike again, whoever did this?
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, criminal minds are criminal minds.
Tips were thin, leads dissolved. And with every day that passed without a confirmed sighting, without a credible account of where Nancy had gone or who had taken her, the investigation grew heavier with the weight of unanswered questions. One of the first things Entin noted publicly was something that had already begun to circulate quietly among investigators: the reported possibility of a ransom demand. The mention of Bitcoin, a digital currency that, by design, resists easy tracing, had surfaced early in the case. But almost as quickly as it appeared, it seemed to recede. No proof of life followed, no verifiable communication, no confirmation that whoever had taken Nancy Guthrie was actually interested in money at all. The ransom thread simply hung there, incomplete, raising more questions than it resolved. That pattern of details that appeared and then refused to solidify would define this case in its earliest weeks. To understand why the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie struck so many people as profoundly unsettling, it helps to understand who she was before any of this happened. The picture that emerged from those who knew her was of a woman who had lived a long life built on consistency and connection. At 84, she was not someone who moved through the world unnoticed. She was a mother, a grandmother, the kind of person whose absence from a family gathering registers immediately, not gradually. People around her were attuned to her presence in the way you become attuned to someone who has occupied a central place in your life for decades. She was also, by all accounts, a woman of deliberate routine, not prone to wandering, not someone who would leave without a word. Her limited mobility meant that her daily life had a structure to it, a predictability that, in normal circumstances, was simply the shape of a life lived carefully in one place. In the context of a disappearance investigation, that same predictability became something else entirely. It meant that whoever had entered her world had done so with some knowledge of it, had understood at some level what her days looked like and how to move within them without triggering alarm. That understanding, investigators would come to believe, did not develop overnight.
As the search for answers into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance continues, over the last week, so many people still showing up and showing their support for Savannah.
I've watched the Today Show for many years, and you become family.
The Tucson neighborhood where Nancy lived was the kind of place people move to precisely because it feels safe. Residential streets, familiar faces, the low ambient noise of a community that largely keeps to itself. Violent crime in that context is not impossible, but it is rare. Elderly victims rarer still, which is part of why the case attracted the attention it did, and why, even in its earliest stages, investigators found themselves reaching for frameworks that went beyond the standard missing persons playbook. Enter Ann Burgess. Her name carries weight in criminal profiling circles that is difficult to overstate. A pioneer in the systematic study of criminal behavior, the real-world figure whose work directly informed the research depicted in the acclaimed series Mindhunter, Burgess had spent decades developing the understanding that violent crime is never random. It is patterned. It is driven by psychology. And it leaves behind traces that, when read correctly, reveal not just what happened, but who made it happen and why. When Burgess began examining the elements of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, she was not looking at the surface details. She was looking at the decisions embedded within them, and what she found pointed towards something far more complicated than a crime of opportunity. Hi viewers, before we go any further, I want to hear from you. What is the very first detail about this case that made you stop and think something wasn't right? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single one, because here is what matters about the question Burgess was now working to answer. The absence of forced entry is not simply a curious forensic detail. In the language of criminal behavior analysis, it is a statement. It tells us something deliberate about the person responsible, about their patience, their access, their relationship to the space they entered. A locked door that remains locked afterward is not evidence of nothing. It is evidence of someone who either knew the code, held the key, or was already inside before the locks mattered. And if the last option is true, if someone had entered that house and waited, quietly, in the hours or minutes before Nancy Guthrie became aware of their presence, then what investigators were dealing with was not a spontaneous act. It was a planned one, rehearsed perhaps, calculated with a degree of premeditation that reframes everything. The blood, the absence of a trail, the silence that followed. 72 days would pass without an arrest. 72 days of a family waiting, of investigators re-examining the same evidence from new angles, of a community that had largely gone back to its routines while one woman remained missing and one case remained open. Brian Entin continued to report, and Burgess continued to analyze, and somewhere beneath the surface of what had already been made public, a theory was forming, one that would, when it finally came into focus, shift the entire moral weight of the case. Not just who took Nancy Guthrie, but why, and whether she had ever been the real target at all. The answer to that question, when it finally emerged, would leave no one in the room feeling certain about anything. If this case already has you asking questions you cannot easily put down, that is not an accident. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next story coming your way, because the cases we cover here are the ones that stay with you. The ones that deserve more than silence. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters here, and it just might inspire someone else to speak up too. Because somewhere in Tucson, Arizona, a door was opened, and we still do not fully know who opened it.
He says investigators are still actively working their leads, including that unknown DNA.
Is there still hope that this mixed DNA will be able to be identified?
Absolutely. That's going to get us to somebody, we hope.
72 days is a long time to wait for an answer that never comes. In missing persons investigations, the the first 48 hours are treated as the most critical window. Every day that folds into the next without a confirmed lead, without a credible sighting, without a name attached to a motive, each one hardens the silence. It allows evidence to age. It gives whoever is responsible more time to settle into whatever version of normalcy they have constructed around what they did. In the Guthrie case, 72 days passed. No arrest. Brian Entin had been watching this investigation from the moment it entered the national conversation. As a reporter who built his reputation tracking cases that resist easy resolution, he understood what it meant when a case this visible moved this slowly. And what he kept returning to in his reporting, in his on-camera analysis, was the same detail investigators themselves could not move past. No forced entry. And without forced entry, every assumption about this case had to be re-examined from the beginning. Because here is what that detail actually means. If a door was not broken, if a window was not compromised, if there was no mechanical evidence that anyone forced their way inside, then Nancy Guthrie's home was accessed by someone who either had a key, was given permission to enter, or had been inside long before she had reason to protect herself. Each of those three possibilities points in the same direction. This was not random. This was not impulsive. Whoever entered that house had a relationship with the space they entered and the person who lived there. That conclusion rewrites everything that came before it. In the early days, investigators had considered the explanations that typically present themselves first in cases involving elderly individuals who vanish without obvious cause. A medical event, disorientation. These are not unreasonable starting points, but they dissolve quickly when confronted with the physical evidence at the scene. The blood found inside the home and near the back threshold, combined with the complete absence of a continuing trail, did not point toward an accident. It pointed toward something contained, something that happened within a specific time frame and was then deliberately managed. The trail ended not because there was nothing more to find, but because someone decided where it would end. That decision was intentional, and intentional decisions leave psychological fingerprints. Then came the Bitcoin, the mention of a possible ransom demand, referencing cryptocurrency, surfaced in early reporting and shifted the conversation significantly. A ransom implies a living person. It implies negotiation. It implies that whoever was responsible wanted something concrete in return. But this particular channel went silent almost immediately. No proof of life followed. No verifiable communication. No transactional follow-through of any kind. The Bitcoin thread appeared once and then vanished, just like Nancy. When a ransom demand fails to develop, investigators are left with a question that changes the entire direction of a case. What if the ransom was not real? What if it was constructed as misdirection, designed to redirect investigators toward a financial motive that did not exist, and away from whatever the actual motive was? If the demand was staged, then the person who staged it understood how law enforcement responds to ransom situations. They understood that cryptocurrency creates complications. They calculated the delay it would cause. That level of thinking does not come from someone who acted without preparation. It comes from someone who had considered the investigation before the investigation began. And Burgess has spent her professional life studying exactly this kind of mind. Her foundational work in criminal behavioral analysis, developed alongside the FBI's behavioral science unit during the late 1970s and 1980s, established the profiling framework investigators still use today. When Burgess examined the Guthrie case, she was not reading isolated details. She was reading a pattern. Organized scene, managed evidence, a false lead, sustained silence across weeks of high-profile coverage. That pattern pointed toward one conclusion. The motive was never money. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss what comes next. The story behind the motive and what Burgess concluded about who this crime was actually designed to hurt is the piece of this case that changes everything. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters here, and it may be the thing that keeps this conversation alive, because Nancy Guthrie's family is still waiting for answers.
Nanos also confirmed investigators have been looking into a potential internet issue or other electrical disruption the night of the abduction.
There was a timeline when things went offline. So we're looking into that. Why did that occur? We check with our power companies. We check with others in the neighborhood.
And that's beyond just the fact that the suspect took the camera off.
Correct.
And those answers have not run out of time yet. There is a specific kind of grief that has no end point. Not the grief of loss, of knowing someone is gone and slowly learning to carry that, but the grief of not knowing, of waking up every morning in the same city where someone you love was last seen, and having no answer for the most basic question a family can ask. Where are they? What happened? Are they coming home? That is the grief Nancy Guthrie's family carried through those 72 days and beyond. The public dimension of this case added pressure to that weight. When a disappearance reaches national coverage, the family becomes part of the story in ways they did not choose. And for Nancy Guthrie's daughter, whose own public-facing life made her more visible than most families in this position, that exposure carried dimensions most missing persons cases do not. It was that visibility Burgess would eventually suggest that may have been a factor from the very beginning. To understand why, you have to think carefully about what behavioral profiling actually looks for. Burgess is not simply asking who could have done this. She is asking why anyone would choose this specific person, at this specific time, using this specific method. When the answers to those three questions converge on something other than financial gain, what typically emerges is a motive rooted in relationship. In history, in some conflict that had been building quietly, invisibly, over a period of time stretching back years or even decades. The profile of an organized offender with an emotional motive is not a profile of a stranger. It is a profile of someone who knows the terrain, someone for whom the routine of a daily schedule, the layout of a home, the timing of an ordinary morning represents familiar information rather than intelligence that had to be gathered. That kind of familiarity develops through proximity, through sustained attention that the person being observed has no reason to notice. This is where the concept of long-term pre-offense behavior becomes significant. Person who plans, who thinks through logistics, selects a target, chooses a method and considers the aftermath, leaves a trail of decisions that, in retrospect, often appear obvious. Pattern of contact, a shift in behavior noticed by people around them but never fully understood. A history of grievance written off as ordinary friction rather than recognized for the weight it carried for the person feeling it. The question Burgess was now asking, the one that redirected the investigation's focus, was whether that trail existed in the history of people connected to Nancy Guthrie's inner circle. Not necessarily in Nancy's own history, but in the history of whoever this crime was ultimately designed to reach. Because if the theory holds that Nancy was not the primary target, and the behavioral evidence was pointing strongly in that direction, then the logic of the crime inverts entirely. You do not take Nancy Guthrie to hurt Nancy Guthrie. You take Nancy Guthrie to reach someone who cannot be reached any other way, someone whose own life or position makes them less accessible. You choose the person closest to them, the person they cannot protect, the person whose absence produces the most irreversible pain. An 84-year-old woman with limited mobility, living alone in a home everyone around her considered safe, represents exactly that kind of vulnerability. Once investigators accepted that framework, the entire suspect pool shifted. They were no longer looking for someone with a grievance against an elderly woman. They were looking for someone with a grievance against someone she loved. And that person likely had no direct conflict with Nancy at all, which is precisely why her name had produced no clear suspect in the early stages of the investigation. Investigators had been looking at Nancy's world. They needed to be looking at someone else's. Burgess also raised the possibility that the level of organization involved may have exceeded what a single person could manage alone. Not because of the physical demands, but because of the logistical demands of staging a scene, maintaining a false ransom thread, and sustaining silence across months of national coverage. Two people sharing a grievance and keeping each other accountable to silence is harder to break than one. But it is not unbreakable. Time applies pressure, and pressure eventually produces cracks. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications. What the profiling revealed about the emotional core of this motive, and what it means for the people still living with the consequences.
The guy might have tattoos all over his face. I might have the facial hair wrong. but I had to try, and I'll take the hit if I'm wrong.
Is what the next chapter covers. Leave a comment. Share this with someone who should know about this case. Your voice keeps the story in the light, because the truth here is not buried. It is waiting to be spoken by someone who already knows it. And Burgess did not arrive at her conclusion quickly, and that matters. Conclusions in behavioral analysis that come fast are conclusions that should be questioned. The methodology Burgess built her career on does not reach for the nearest available theory. It starts with documented decisions, with physical evidence, with the full chronology of what happened, and works backward through the psychology of whoever made those decisions until a profile takes shape from the inside out. What took shape in the Guthrie case rejected money as the primary motive entirely. This was not a minor adjustment. It was a structural reorientation.
How many criminals?
Everything investigators had spent weeks pursuing, the Bitcoin thread, the ransom theory, the assumption that someone wanted to be paid, had to be set aside. Strip that assumption away and the entire investigative framework has to be rebuilt from the foundation. Burgess's conclusion was precise. This crime was driven by the desire to cause pain. Not financial pain, psychological pain, the kind that does not resolve. The kind that follows a person from room to room and grows heavier with time. In behavioral terms, that motive is called expressive. Unlike instrumental violence, which uses harm as a tool to achieve a concrete goal, expressive motivation is an end in itself. It does not require a transaction to complete. It requires an audience. It requires a specific person to receive a specific message. And that message, in this case, was about power. About demonstrating to someone still living that the person responsible could reach them in ways they had no ability to prevent. That realization brought a specific focus back to the center of the case. Nancy's daughter. The public nature of her daughter's life had made her both more visible and, paradoxically, more protected. Her professional profile generated enough institutional attention that a direct approach would carry significant risk. But Nancy, living quietly, her schedule known, her vulnerabilities apparent, carried none of that protection. She was accessible in ways her daughter was not. And that accessibility, the behavioral analysis suggested, was the deciding factor. The psychology here is documented across decades of case study. Crimes that target one person in order to hurt another follow a recognizable pattern. What makes them particularly difficult to investigate is that the person with the most powerful motive has the least obvious connection to the victim. There is no direct grievance between Nancy Guthrie and whoever took her, which is why no clear suspect emerged from her immediate social environment. The suspect was not in her world. They were in someone else's. Investigators now had to map a different set of histories, a different set of unresolved conflicts that had fermented, over time, into something that demanded expression. That mapping required access to information the family may not have immediately recognized as relevant. Conversations from years back, relationships that ended badly, situations where someone felt wronged in a way that was never addressed and never forgotten. Brian Entin, in his continued coverage, noted something that aligned precisely with what Burgess had concluded. This case, he observed, did not feel like a crime that was finished. It felt like one that was waiting, as though whoever had set it in motion had not yet reached whatever destination they had intended when they made their first decision. That observation carries weight. If the motive was expressive, if the goal was to deliver a message, then the question is whether the message landed the way the sender intended. If it did not, the sender is still watching, still measuring the distance between what they did and what they wanted it to produce, still waiting to know whether their calculation was correct. That psychological restlessness is what creates exposure. It is the behavior that generates the mistake. And it is the reason that, in cases driven by emotional motive rather than financial logic, time is rarely neutral. It builds pressure. And pressure, applied long enough to the right point,